Okay, we're going to get started in about 2 minutes. If you haven't dialed in yet, well, obviously you've dialed in if you're hearing this. So give us a few minutes and we're going to get started. All right, hello. This is Ronnie Mitra from Layer 7 Technologies. I'm really excited to be talking to you today. We have this great webinar on designing usable APIs. We're excited to have Randy Heffner from Forrester joining us. He's going to spend the first 25 minutes or so talking about a lot of aspects of API design. I'm going to follow that with something I'm passionate about, and that's the developer experience. But before we dive in, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. We really want you to send in questions. There's a little box in the WebEx. Just type any questions you have in there. We're not going to answer them while we're talking, but after I speak, we'll spend some time and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Both Randy and I will. If we can't answer all of them, we'll find some time to do that later, maybe offline. If you're tweeting today, use the hashtag L7webinar, and feel free to follow us on Twitter if you'd like to follow Forrester, Layer 7, or Randy and myself. So with that, Randy, I'm going to hand it over to you, and let's get started. Yeah, I think we're trying to find Randy at the moment. So just
I'm sorry, I had my phone on. I had my phone on mute for the time there, so my apologies. But yeah, thanks, Ronnie. The keys to well-designed APIs, that's what we're talking about. And if you listen to some voices out there in the industry, you get kind of the sense that, oh, this is pretty much an easy thing, identify a resource, name you some verbs, say whether you want JSON or XML, and that's pretty much it, right? Well, there's actually a lot more to doing a well-designed API than that. We're going to touch on some important aspects of that, and leave a couple of things untouched. But anyhow, so the first thing to recognize and realize is that although you hear lots about Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon, whomever else, as you hear API conversations, Netflix and others, enterprises are deep into APIs. Here's just a small number of the many large enterprises and smaller enterprises that are doing APIs into their businesses. I mean, financial exchange in Turkey, the big credit card players, banks, your local pharmacy, Walgreens, the tax and customs folks in the country of Georgia. So lots of folks going, lots of things going with APIs out there. And here we're talking external APIs. And there's a number of different ways you might think about external APIs. And this is important to recognize up front because these different angles into the API space lead to different ways of thinking about and designing APIs, and we'll talk about that. But in some case, it might be a customer service sort of thing. Saxo Bank and Optify. Optify is think of them as a lead generation company, a marketing servicing company. They're allowing customers directly manipulate their account information, their order information, and so there's a customer service sort of play there. You can white label your business. You get the big travel companies like a Travelocity or Expedia. You may be making a travel reservation somewhere, but really it's going through Travelocity or Expedia. We've seen others do this. Saw a training company do this, or a test administration company white label their business through APIs and the like. Process optimization. Somebody like a Conway Freight has long been out there with external APIs for creating shipping tickets and managing the shipping process, and that can happen across any number of different industries. In some cases, it's a market mindshare play. You keep your name in front of folks. USA Today, Yellow Pages, particularly Canadian Yellow Pages, Yellow API. When you use their APIs, they require you to put some branding, so that people realize the information they're seeing came from Yellow Pages or USA Today. They don't charge you for the APIs, but they're expanding their market mindshare. There might be channel enablement, where you are allowing partners to basically extend your business into many different channels and places that you might not have direct access. The granddaddy of them all, the Amazon Store API, which is actually known as the Product Advertising API, is that sort of thing. So you started to see Amazon, buy from Amazon presence on any mom and pop website across the internet. Lots of different things for external APIs, but the API conversation is not just about external APIs. And we'll talk about some categories of APIs in a minute, but the API category that you're dealing with is really the first major area to understand in doing strong API design. And we'll talk about 4 categories. But this has to do with the business context of API use and the overall design or character of the API. And it's going to be different if you are a Facebook, allowing people to do social sharing, or if you are Capital One, allowing people to redeem points through an API, or if you're Sears, selling washers and T-shirts through an API. And or whether you use an APIs internally. So that's a major context area. We'll touch on that some. There are different API types that vary based on the function that you're providing, the purpose of the API, and where it fits in the context of an architecture stack. These also impact the kinds of messaging paradigms that you might use and the way you might design and structure an API. There's then these kind of lead down to getting to the technical design of the interface itself. What messaging style, how do you structure it, how do you handle quality of service issues? We'll talk mostly about this category of concerns in the rest of the call. And we'll talk some about messaging style, request structure. There's some things that I'll leave for a later date, things like transaction handling. How do you make sure that you're really doing good, strong transactions and reliable transactions, or error handling? These are sort of more advanced topics that I didn't think we could squeeze into today, but we will touch quickly on security and attachments as a couple of more advanced areas in API design. There are community concerns, and these I'll only talk about here, but the effective API limits, how you do testing, how you support your APIs can all have an effect on how you design your APIs. Let me give you an example here, because maybe the effective API limits is sort of less immediately apparent as to how that might factor in. Google, for example, limits the number of Google Map API calls you can make based on the number of map loads that you do. Okay, so the API design better be clear on when am I doing a map load versus some manipulation of a map that I already loaded versus something else. Well, how I design the API needs to be clear in relation to the API limit, or if I set a limit one way that doesn't really match the way it's used in terms of the design of the API, then I'm going to get in trouble. People are not going to be happy. Things like testing, Travelocity, Expedia provide guidance on how you can provide dummy data in order to signal that this is a test API call, and that affects how you design the APIs as well. The last topic, which really could be a whole webinar in and of itself, is how do you prepare for the future? And here the two key things that I'll mention is as you're designing an API, you can wind up designing in a more narrow and focused way or in a more open-ended way. An open-ended way will meet a wider range of future scenarios, and that might be something like an open data access. Here's the data, do whatever you want to with it, I don't care. But how people use the data and how they interpret it is also wide open, and that might not be what you want. So you may need to have a more narrow design that handles a transaction the way that you need to handle a transaction in your domain of whatever it might be, medicine or finance or whatever, in order to make sure that transaction is handled properly. So you may not want to do as open-ended design. That affects how you're preparing for the future. But in either case, what you want to do is understand how the portfolio of APIs you're providing adds up to a coherent set of functions over time. So these are the major areas. Let's dive into API categories. You certainly are going to have folks that use your functionality through whatever digital experiences you have, mobile, web, whatever, and that aren't using an API. But when you get into using an API space, we identify at Forrester 4 major kinds of categories. And the fourth one that I put up here might be a little bit of a mind bender, but I think it's an important category to consider. The first and the one that most dominates the API discussion these days are what we would call open web APIs. This is the sort of thing that Amazon did as the granddaddy back in the early 2000s when they said, well, we're not going to choose our partners anymore for our Amazon store. We're going to let them choose us. We're going to have this wide open API at the edge, very slight bit of registration, and Amazon will do a small amount of vetting when you sign up to be a product advertising API participant. But you get a cut of the revenue, and great. It gave Amazon lots of presence across the internet. Tech-savvy consumers might use this. Website developers might add something to their site. You know, I do Amazon kind of links on a small little film analysis website that I do. But the real category that you're aiming for is value-added innovators or digital disruptors, people that can bring you someplace that you wouldn't go, that you ride the wave of somebody else's success because you've sort of switched the model and opened yourself up at the edge to who knows what sort of business models you might be a part of. Very interesting, and this is the kind of open API that you would be thinking of in terms of the Facebooks and Googles and Twitters of the world. The next major category is B2B APIs, and here we're aiming at optimized business between typically known partners, and we're trying to improve supply chain processes or improve a partner's ability to sell our products or service our products, or we're enabling a distribution chain, or any number of other B2B kinds of scenarios. These APIs might be handling millions of dollars in one exchange, one API call. They have higher demands for integrity, data validation, and the like. And the context is also one, because of the business value involved, your partners and suppliers and those using the API might be more inclined to spend money to really make the integration work deeply and very well. So that B2B APIs. The next is internal APIs. And here you can think about things that are sort of a continuation of the broad SOA story that we've been developing in the industry over the past few years. Couple of more comments on that as we get into some other farther into the space here, but open web or B2B APIs might be leveraging these internal APIs. Then the last is product APIs. Now, here's the way that this might sort of twist your head around a bit. When you're actually using a product API, it feels more like one of the other kinds of APIs. But the thing is, whether you have a software product like a server or a gateway product or an enterprise application or a SaaS software as a service product, or you have a physical product like a refrigerator or an automobile or a home automation controller, or a service like Optify's lead generation service that I mentioned before, you can think in terms of the API being part of how you extend that product into a broader ecosystem. And that might include digital disruptors and value-added innovators as well, but it's more centered on what the product is doing and what the product's value is. And so it's worth considering that as a separate design point. And in the end, it may be used just the same as an open web API or a B2B API. But each one of these will lead you into different ways of thinking about the value and the design of your APIs. Now, within any one of these scenarios, there are going to be different API types. And the type of API, the function, the way it's operating will affect how it's designed. And as I move into this conversation, I want to introduce a term that is, I think, a key lightning rod for how you think about all the rest of what I'll say in this webinar, all these design concerns, is the key single best practice, I think, is to design for comprehensibility. How easy is it for people to understand what the API does and how to use it? And understanding the API type is part of that. So if you have a data API, this allows you to play in the data economy. You could charge for the data and charge for calls through the API, whatever you're going to do. What you're fundamentally working with is an API that accesses a particular entity, a particular resource, or a collection of those resources in order to identify the one that it needs, in order to read. Most of the open web APIs there are about read access. Not as many of them are about update access. But a data API could be read, update, create, delete, these entities and within the collections and find things within collections. This is a very heavily resource-oriented kind of thing. The mental model of the user is, of the API user is, I'm manipulating a thing, an entity, a resource, or the data about it. Transaction APIs take on a different character. These are really about actions. I'm doing something like submitting an order that affects many different entities. It's affecting the order, it's creating shipping records, it's updating customer history, it's processing payments, lots of things going on in one action. And it can be confusing sometimes to try to smash that into something that feels like a data API. We'll talk more about that. But these two data transaction APIs correlate with what some of you who followed my research will understand as an SOA business service. These are business units of work, business things that need to be done. The rest are more technical. The next three, integration, user interface, and application component APIs, are more application services. So an integration API is built around, I need to connect and push data between these two applications, or how do I get data into an application from whatever other source. Doesn't need to be a point-to-point kind of consideration. But it's a technical oriented design point, not a business design point. User interface APIs might serve fragments of a UI or fully formed UI components that appear on a page. And we'll come back to this, but I'll mention as an example that the Twitter embedded timeline API. There might be application component APIs that provide some nature of business function support. an address validation, but or maybe a face recognition, Lambda face recognition API, for example, or let me give you someone's IP address and you tell me what time it is in the place where that IP address is thought to be resident. But business function kind of supports. And then any sort of utility APIs correlates to what I've described before as an infrastructure service. Technical support, might be security, authentication, authorization, logging, technical format conversions. These are designed differently, focused differently in terms of how the user of the API will think about how they're being used. Now, there's an interesting side note here to touch on this point with APIs, because a lot of the API conversation relates to mobile and mobile apps, and we need to do mobile APIs, and REST works better for mobile because it tends to have lighter weight scripting language oriented programming environments and the like. And when you look inside the API space, you realize that the mobile stack is using multiple kinds of APIs at the same time. There are things that are more transaction-oriented APIs where I might have a facade for a core business transaction, like a submit order or an account conversion. I also have APIs that really are operating within the UI tier, if you can think of it that way. I'm retrieving and providing data that is managed within a mobile back-end environment, where the mobile back-end is maintaining a large collection, and I am just presenting a small part of that collection in my mobile UI. Or I might have data-oriented APIs that are caching data locally, either in the back end or the device. But understanding these different kinds of APIs is important so that you don't smash all of mobile development into one single API type. Okay, now I mentioned a moment ago the conversation around relating APIs and SOA, and that's service-oriented architecture. There's another interesting connection here, where in the conversation about APIs, there's this sort of thread in the conversation that everything in the future should be REST, and SOAP is old, dead technology, so no one should be using SOAP unless they're just trying to support some legacy kind of system or service that's already been built. Okay, not so fast. Let's watch out for this REST versus SOAP religion. Now, certainly for open web APIs, if you're thinking about SOAP for an open web API, you better have a really good reason, because that community, that environment, pretty much demands REST. For mobile applications, for some of the reasons I mentioned, scripting languages and the like that don't support SOAP so well, then REST API versus a SOAP API is an important aspect. But when you look at the industry trends and ask developers, which should be the most REST-focused audience out there, when you ask developers, as we did in this survey, what of these different ways of building systems and thinking about services are you using, the audience that is expanding their use of SOAP and REST is about the same. And certainly a lot of that SOAP is going for internal type usage. But let me tell you as well, there's a major travel provider that has a SOAP API at the edge, and they credit this API with having brought $1 billion of additional revenue into their travel network. And when asked the question, will you be creating a REST version of that API, they say, we've looked into it, we've talked to our partners, we've asked, but we don't see a good reason to do REST at this time. SOAP is working very well for us, it's providing what we need. So that's not a reason to do SOAP, but that is a reason to understand how it plays in different messaging types, what its value points are, and where you might use it. And it certainly could enter into new B2B APIs, and that's one place that we'll talk about here coming up. But one thing that I also want to point out on this slide is that notice that service-oriented architecture as a notion, which also gets some negative press in today's conversation on APIs, has a very high audience that is expanding use of SOA, and the bottom line there is it's a very important, continuing, ongoing part of the conversation. The way I think about it is SOA is your foundation for agility. REST extends that agility, or excuse me, APIs extend that agility, and it's not REST and SOAP. REST is API, SOAP is SOA. Don't get caught up in that bit of religion either. REST and SOAP can both be used with APIs or SOA. That's a conversation for another day to really sort that out, but I wanted to at least provide a couple of clues for you in there. Now, the different messaging types you might choose for your API as you're designing the interface vary fundamentally in terms of reach and quality of service. An important thing to understand as I talk about some of these areas of quality of service, you can achieve the same level of quality of service with whatever messaging type that you might use. The question here really as I'm coming at it is how much does it cost to achieve a given level of quality of service based on how much you're doing with the programming and care and tending and feeding of that API. Freeform REST, this will feed any API category, especially important for open web. The way to think about it is, yes, it's based on open standards, but it's always a custom configuration of open standards. You get limited validation with JSON, and even as the JSON community tries to expand and create a schema for JSON, there's a lot of pushback in the industry. You might add hypermedia links to REST APIs. You're creating a higher skill requirement for your audience, and that may limit your reach some. There's some structured formats for REST, OData being the one that's been out there the longest, and that provides some good standardized patterns and defined types for JSON and other ways of using REST. But the REST community out there tends to push back on structure and formal standards, so you may need to hide some of that in order to gain broad reach in the market. SOAP is very heavily used, obviously, for internal APIs. Some B2B APIs might benefit from the stronger data validation out of the box with SOAP, some of the stronger standards for security federation and the like. And message-oriented middleware, I still have to mention out there, had the highest expansion rate on that previous slide of any of the messaging styles. But this would be pretty much limited to internal APIs. Very few B2B APIs might have. But the big benefit with message-oriented middleware is higher reliability with transactional messaging. So important aspects as you think about those different types. There are a number of different API types that are more specialized as well. JavaScript APIs, the Twitter embedded timeline uses a JavaScript framework basically that calls an API on your behalf. Language bindings where you create an SDK that may use APIs under the covers, but this provides more natural programming constructs for somebody working in Java or C# or whatever. The box, which everybody knows Dropbox. Box is sort of more an enterprise-focused Dropbox-like vendor. RSS and Atom can be used for periodic distribution, streaming APIs for continuous information distribution, and there are some special cases where in the bioinformatics space, XMPP is seen as an interesting message protocol, or Ford's OpenXC for auto-based integration communicates over USB and Bluetooth. So we'll go quickly through some of these because I'm having too much fun and talking too long here. But as you think about designing for comprehensibility, you have to think in terms of the structure of the REST API that you are building out. You ought to be encrypting your REST API call via an SSL type of connection typically, or if you don't, assume that credentials will be stolen and understand how you're going to deal with that. Domain names, keep domain names stable. You may have some domain name grouping or macro level routing. Amazon EC2 puts a region in the domain name. Salesforce might put a chatter group or chatter domain or a server environment in the API domain name, but you need to make sure that those are stable so that people are not always confused about which domain they should be accessing. Within the API request, resources are all the rage, but as I've been trying to describe, functions, actions are sometimes more clear and direct and comprehensible. So be sure to think in terms of and be careful about the over-focusing on resources versus actions. And E-Trade's API is an interesting one to look at in that regard if you want to think about that. And the query string. Query string can give you some simple, straightforward options on an API, but be careful about using it to introduce whole new API functions that can get very confusing very quickly and destroy comprehensibility. Keep your messaging simple if you can be, but don't be afraid to be more complex if you need to be. JSON is fast becoming the preferred open web payload, but XML is out there still and has benefits for validation and for vertical industry standards. XHTML, not so common, but has some benefits for validation as well, and also some benefits for integration with web applications. Zip files are common enough out there. You don't see them that often. They're going to reduce your reach, but if you're dealing with large payloads, having a zip format may be an interesting way to reduce the size of network overhead. I mentioned links before, and having no links in your REST API is the simplest to reach a broad audience. If you put them in as HTML relations, it provides an easy, clean way to parse for a specific link type, and here you might look at the way that Rotten Tomatoes does its API. If you have links as payload data, then there's probably the greatest amount of programming flexibility there. Now, the next thing I want to touch on is REST verbs and sort of resource orientation and the like. Well, there's the most common verbs that people talk about when designing REST APIs are get, post, put, and delete. And those are roughly correlating to create, read, update, delete model, but you have to be careful how about post and put. There are some nuances there. You might use head to get just some basic information about the API, or options to get some understanding of what the API can do, or patch to do a partial update. But here's the thing. You'll hear a lot of conversations out there that make it sound like it's just simple and straightforward how you use these verbs. But let me ask this. Which is the correct handling of doing a post of an order? Some would say you get out there and what you ought to do is just submit the order for processing, because that's what you do with orders. Others would say, well, no, you're mixing too much in there. Just submit the order, but store the order, but don't submit it for processing. Or to sort of fit in a transaction-ish kind of angle in that, one might include an order status and say, if you make the order status equal to submit, then the post should submit the order. Or maybe if it doesn't pass validation, you don't even, so what should you do? Well, this would be an interesting topic, interesting question to ask if you want to start arguments among a REST audience. But here's the real answer, is whatever it says in the documentation is what's correct. In other words, there is no common universal understanding of what that means. That's part of the thing that makes REST a proprietary configuration of open standards, which is not to say it's bad, it's just to say the reality of what it is. REST attachments are an interesting other kind of aspect here. For example, with the Flickr API, URI reference is simplest. If I don't try to provide you with the asset, but I just give you a link to it. That's what Flickr does when you want to retrieve a photo. I could put it in a binary encoding in a payload. That's non-trivial processing. I could have a separate attachment API altogether, and this would make it very clear what media types. Am I adding a JPEG or a PNG or an XLS file, a spreadsheet or whatever. There's some issues with metadata there. Multi-part messages, allow me to have multiple attachments, but these are more difficult to program, and that's what Flickr does when you're adding a photo. Plan for versioning. Versioning, you can put a version early in the URI to denote some sort of family of APIs that all go together. You might put it late in the API, which allows each API to be independently versioned. Some put it in the query string. I consider this to be a danger zone because version should be a required part of the API. You'll get into some upgradability kinds of concerns if you don't have it there. There are some other ways you could do it, but you got to have a good reason to do one of these other ways. They're not as common, and they introduce some binding and coupling that you may not want. If you're doing security, here's where there's some other differences between open APIs and B2B. Open web partnering, maybe all you have is an API key, and maybe you require a digital signature, which actually provides better protection for the API user so that nobody can steal their key and use up their quota. But that might be all you need to do. But if you're exposing someone else's data, a la Facebook, you're exposing your customer's data, that's when the key mechanism in the market these days is an OAuth protocol for letting customers authorize use of their data. When you get into B2B APIs, if you and your partners own the data, you might be able to just do two-way SSL and leave it at that. Or you might need some federated identity within the mix. Or maybe you are like an investment company whose customer is an employer whose employees have accounts. Well, now you may need to get permission from the actual account holder, the employees, in addition to having B2B process and partnering kinds of concerns. So maybe you get federated identity and OAuth in the mix. If you've got internal APIs, you've got wide latitude, and what you're doing for SOA security will be a strong foundation there. API design recommendation then, start with your purpose and your audience. Favor REST, heavily favor REST for external reach. Don't fear SOAP if there's a good reason to gain some of its benefits. And documentation is always important, but with REST in particular, assume nothing in your documentation. Your documentation is key to helping people know what's going to happen when they use the APIs. And then decide how open-ended to be, whether data or transaction-oriented, and how you use query parameters to use special functions. Ronnie, back to you. Hope I didn't use up all your time.
That was really good from an overview perspective, right? I mean, just consider, so in about 25 minutes, you found out there's all these things to consider when designing an API. And the surprising thing is, I think that's only the tip of the iceberg, right? I know Randy probably would have loved to have gone on for about 2 or 3 hours talking about all the various bits that you need to consider. What we can really take away is that there isn't a prescriptive one-size-fits-all approach here, right? There's considerations you need to have. You need to make rational choices. And that seems to be the big challenge for us. When we sit down to design an API, we're faced with all of these questions, all of these decisions to make, right? Starting with the really big ones about how do we align this design, align this program with bigger business goals, strategy goals. But then all of these technical interface decisions, right? The types, the categories, the formats that Randy described. SOAP versus the HTTP RESTful URI style. Protocol choices, HTTP or WebSockets or XMPP or CoAP. New ones keep emerging, right? And that's the big ones. Then you have kind of a death by 1,000 pins with, how do you represent a collection? How do you show a user that they've made an error? All these smaller decisions to be made. So how do you go forward? If we look at how people typically design, it might look something like this, right? If we decided we were going to make a URI-style API, a kind of RESTful one, maybe we're making an API that will give people an inventory of apples in our warehouse. So we sit down and we look at our business model, our object model, our data model, and we say, well, we've got bushels and we've got apples, and we're going to expose these as resources. So we start carving it up and we talk about relationships between entities. That's usually a first step, right? And then we might talk about how we want to expose this data because we realize this is a very data-oriented interface. So we might argue for 2 or 3 days about capitalization, about which word should come first. Should there be a bracket at the end? We get lost in these details, and eventually we agree on a URI. And then finally we talk about how to actually get data, how to read, how to write. You know, Randy did a good job of describing some of that challenge. It's not as simple as we want CRUD to be. There's all these kind of hidden decisions to make. And the thing is, you have to make decisions. Because if you don't make any decisions, you end up with kind of a dog's breakfast of an interface, and we can't have that. The problem is this process of designing an API is good. I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing this, but it's not enough. Amazingly, the most important perspective is missing here, right? Conspicuously absent is the user perspective, the person who we're actually building the API for. And that's really what we're trying to solve. That's the problem we're trying to solve, expanding our perspective with this idea of developer experience. Many of us are familiar with user experience, right? User experience is prevalent in web design, mobile application design, in physical product design. For us as API designers, it's developers who are our users, right? That's our target audience. And to be clear here, I'm not talking about the developers in your organization who build the backend systems, who build the APIs. I'm talking about the developers you're trying to reach, the people who are going to write those applications that make calls to your APIs. We have a specific type of user, that's the developer, hence the term developer experience. The interesting thing here, this idea of experience, is actually a measure of emotion, a measure of how people feel. So when we talk about developer experience, it's actually related to how developers feel when they use your API, which is a really odd concept if you've spent the last month or two studying HTTP specifications and looking at the PhD thesis with the chapter on REST, right? And now suddenly we're talking about feelings. The idea here is that having this as a target can be a guidepost for you. So I'm not promising you that the decision suddenly will be made easy, but it gives you a chance to start making the right decisions early on. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. I want to talk about DX from a partner API perspective. You know, the challenge in this space, we all have different terminology. Randy described open web, B2B, internal, and product. A lot of us talk in terms of private, public, and partner APIs, right? Private being the ones that only your own organization uses, public being the ones that you open up to everyone. And partner is more of a B2B API, one that you expose to your partner organizations. We often spend a lot of time talking about public, but I suspect a lot of you on this call are working on partner APIs. If we think about the types of feelings we want to foster within partners, the positive ones tend to be things like safety, trust, empowerment. We want our partners to feel that way. We want to preserve relationships. We also want them to feel senses of amazement, to feel inspiration by what we offer them. Of course, on the flip side, we don't want our partners to feel confused or isolated or embarrassed, right? These aren't values that are conducive to relationship. But more than that, the positive feelings are good for driving projects forward, and the negative feelings are bad for implementation. Ultimately, if we look at the goals of API programs, they're varied, right? Randy kind of took us through that a bit. I mean, there's a lot of segmentation of business drivers and why you might build an API. If you really want to be generic about it, they tend to fall into one of two categories, right? Public APIs especially tend to try and foster growth. So if you're building an API to drive revenue, to charge people for use, or to drive innovation, you're interested in getting as many users as you can. So you really have a high growth target. If you're publishing a private API, you tend to be very interested in cost reduction. How can we make this project cheaper? How can we do it for less money? The nice thing is that this DX focus actually aligns well with both goals. If we're trying to increase growth, offering an API that can be differentiated from market competitors is important. Consider two APIs. If one of them gives the consumer a more positive experience, they're likely to use that second API, the one that offers a better experience. We can also improve stickiness. We want people to come back and use our API again and again, not just for the first project, but for the second or third. If innovation is your target, you want that developer who's going to come up with a killer idea to remember the experience of using your API and make it part of his innovative thought process. And lastly, we tend to talk about good experiences. We tend to share those experiences. So creating an API that projects or provides positive developer experience can lead to great word-of-mouth advertising and can increase growth. Good DX helps with cost reduction as well. It's really synonymous with doing things like reducing the learning curve, right? Making it easier for developers to do the right thing and make them less prone to making mistakes, thus reducing the churn and the troubleshooting. And it tends to offer a better engagement level. People are more engaged with products that are well-designed and offer better experiences. There is a lot you can do to drive positive experiences, right? If we want to get past the cloudy level, beyond just the values, these are just a few of the categories. And they echo some of the things we heard earlier. Learning, for example, is massively important when trying to project a good developer experience. You want to provide an appropriate level of documentation. So that means someone who's new to your API will be a beginner, someone who's used it for a while is an intermediate, and someone who really knows what's happening is going to be an expert. You need documentation that can suit each of those levels. You also really want to embrace the idea of hackability. Not hacking in the security sense, but hackability as in, can they push and pull and prod with your API to see how it works? You know, one of the big challenges in our space is that developers who use APIs have to learn about them, write code, run that code, and then see the results of that call in order to know what's happening, how your API works, and to get that feedback. That's a really long feedback cycle. So when we can offer things like API explorers that sit next to your documentation, that allow a developer to read about what your API does and immediately click a few buttons and see it in action, we're really encouraging a positive DX. Kind of hand in hand with that is the idea of engagement. The faster we can get a developer from learning about your API to making first call, the better off we'll be. And that also includes allowing developers to immediately understand what the value proposition of your API is. Familiarity is an interesting one. We tend to enjoy using products that are familiar. We saw a slide earlier that showed certain types of developers like using certain types of messaging styles. And you can absolutely use that to drive a positive experience. But I'll caution you with this one. You know, it's good to conform to convention because that's the safe choice. But I think in many cases, experience can trump usability. So here, actually, suitability could trump familiarity. Just because someone is used to using a certain type of interface or a certain type of product doesn't mean you can't come up with something that's more suitable for the problem they're trying to solve. Right? So if we have mobile application developers, we know the constraints of mobile networks. Maybe we know the types of user experiences they're trying to provide. It's okay to provide an API that is a little bit different from what they've seen before, as long as you're considering it from their perspective and you're thinking about it from a DX perspective, from a total outcome. What is the positive or negative DX at the end of this? Think also about developer stack. How much additional tools and libraries are you requiring your target developers to add to their stack of tools? Right? It's good to produce SDKs, but make sure this is an audience who actually wants to include that in their client libraries. Beyond these considerations, there's also things like aesthetics, kind of a soft category, so to speak. You can come up with usable content with great function and great services, that's key. But how you present it matters as well. Consider documentation. We can come up with great content for documentation, but there's an impact in how I present that doc. So if I expose it as an ASCII text file that you can download, I'm not going to say whether that's good or bad, but there's certainly going to be an experience as a result of that, right? For some audiences, that might actually be preferred. For others, it may be seen as a lack of professionalism. This point about understanding who you're building this for is key. I think we can't have usability without understanding who our users are. There's the obvious categories. We have platforms, things like mobile, right? Servers, web pages, programming languages like Objective-C or Java. But you can actually go beyond these technical categories and look at softer categories, things like organization types. Are you developing for startup employees? Are you developing for enterprises? If you have an innovation-driven API, you might actually be trying to reach hobbyists, students, right? People who are developing in their spare time. Each of these types of developers might get a different type of experience based on design. You should also consider how much industry or system knowledge your target audience has. If you're building an API for a specific industry vertical, you have your own nomenclature, your own specifications and standards. Are you building this API for other people who understand those things? Or do you have to use a totally different set that makes sense for an outsider? It also makes sense to think about years of experience, not just in the industry or within a computer field, but if you're making a private or partner API, how exposed is your target audience to the business concepts and object models that you're planning on exposing? It's good to listen to our audience. We want to know who they are so we can understand their needs. But at the same time, keep in mind that the user is not always right and the developer is not always right. People don't always do what they say they will. So we can use techniques of observation to help with that. If you're doing a public API, you might invest heavily on this side of the fence, right, in terms of observation. You might do surveying. You might do lab studies. You might do A/B testing. There's a lot we can pull from the UX world in order to do this. If you're doing a private or partner API, you might decide, the return you would get on that investment is not enough. At the very least, what we shouldn't be doing is building an API only based on what developers are telling us, because it might conflict with our organization's needs. Things like brand control, control over the end user experience, and of course, the big elephant in the room is security, right? Classically, we think of security as the opposite of usability. I don't think there's a lot of us who enjoy using secure interfaces, right? We don't enjoy keeping track of passwords and conforming to password policy. But these things are imposed because they're necessary. And you just have to accept that. The key is how you implement it and how you manage it. We have a good example in our industry, I think, with OAuth, right? We went from OAuth 1 to 2. Without getting into the discussion of the finer points, we know that from a developer perspective, OAuth 2 is actually much easier to implement than OAuth 1. So we want to implement just enough security, practical security, pragmatic security, right? The other thing to consider is security isn't always negative from an experience perspective. It may make products less usable, but it can produce better experiences. There are certain classes of developers who will actually prefer to use secure APIs because it promotes feelings of trust, of security, right? Developers are often looking for stable APIs, ones they know that will be around. And an API with no security features may project the appearance of not being one that can be counted upon. If we take all this together, at a high level, you can start to picture that we have a few steps we can move through. The first thing is you need to identify business goals. You have to understand why you're building this API. And the second step is key. You really need to identify who you're building this API for. Who is the developer audience? Find a way to segment them. Following that, you can start to define the interactions, right? Not the technical interactions, but what are the things that this target audience would want to do with your API? You can do that in a number of ways, maybe user stories, develop personas for your target audience, write use cases, however you want to do it. And then you can start to design the API. It's only after figuring out all of this context and background that you sit down and decide, well, should we be doing URI style? Should we do full hypermedia, or is this really a SOAP interface? There's 3 things you can do at the design phase to make this easier. And this is if your budget is limited, you don't have time to do all the really intensive UX stuff. At the very least, you can do these 3 things. When you design your API, write client code for it. In other words, try it out. But you're trying it out from the perspective of your target audience. So if you're developing this for mobile devs who are going to be using Objective-C, hey, sit down and try writing the client in the Objective-C stack and see how it feels. The second thing you really need to do is prototype your API. And this can be complex or it can be ridiculously simple. The key thing here is don't worry about the back end. Don't worry about tying it to real systems. Don't even worry about using the same language you're going to use in production. It doesn't matter. Find a way to implement the interface. And then once you prototype it, the best thing to do is then find developers in the target audience that you're looking for and watch them use it. Talk to them about it, at least show it to them and get feedback, right? So design should be an iterative process. And these 3 steps you should be doing as early as possible. So instead of designing in a vacuum, asking other API designers what they think a URI should look like, go out and find your audience and observe how they interact with your API. In terms of actually delivering this, there's a few things we can do. There's the API itself, right? So you're going to make all these great decisions now based on targeting a positive DX. So that's done. But we also want to foster this human-computer interaction. So we need developer portals. And of course, at Layer 7, we have a great one. These are going to allow you to drive those really good experiences around self-enablement, a feeling of happiness, enjoyment, but making it easy to learn about your API, providing API explorers, giving developers a feeling of empowerment by giving them analytics, self-service registration, all of these really important things that the developer needs from a human-computer level. In addition, we need to impose those restrictions, but we want to do it in a way where we minimize the negative experience. So we need data privacy and access control and brand control and all these other things. An API gateway like the one that Layer 7 provides can help with that. We didn't talk a lot about rate limiting. Rate limiting is massively important, right? Keeping APIs available for legitimate users is really going to drive positive experience as well. So the magic, of course, is when we put all this together. This is really what API management is. We're going to provide the organizational controls for APIs, coupled with an integration to a developer portal that will allow us as an API designer to create a solution that promotes the positive developer experience that we've tried to design. So in summary, we want to start by making rational choices when designing an API, with positive developer experiences as the target for those choices, so that becomes our guidepost. And thirdly, don't underestimate the importance of usability. I think there's a lot of people who don't give credit to how important usability is for private and public APIs. It's just as essential. We don't want to waste productivity. The goal is to reduce cost. Positive DX is the way to get there. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left, but I think we are going to try and answer some questions. If you have a question at the moment, feel free to type it into the Q&A box. And I'm going to look at the first one now. Randy, I think this is more of a question for you. Anytime we mention terminology, there's a question about terminology. So the question is, do you see it?
Yeah, go ahead. Read the question.
Okay, so the question is, what is the difference here between SOA and SOAP-based services? Isn't SOA achieved through SOAP, REST API, et cetera?
Right. Yeah. The question actually really answers itself, but SOA is an architectural style, a set of principles that can be delivered via many different messaging styles, including SOAP, REST, message-oriented middleware, and the like. APIs in the industry conversation is a different angle into that same architecture conversation that SOA is having. So somehow in your organization you need to relate those two terms, SOA and APIs, as architectural concepts, but disconnect those definitions from the messaging styles that are used, because any of these messaging styles we've talked about could be used with SOA or APIs. It's a broader conversation, but that's the concise answer.
Yeah, what's amazing is how much emotional reaction people have nowadays just to the terminology. And that can play into how you document this API, right? Just the fact, whether you call it SOAP, REST, or whatever, is going to have an impact.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so we have another question here. Could you please comment on the value of hypermedia for internal APIs? Is there a benefit of having a link element with a ref, or is it better simply to pass an ID and let a consumer build the URL? So essentially, is it better to embed links and have users move and navigate through the API, or is it better to let them construct the URI? What do you think, Randy?
There really is a situational aspect to this, but here's, I think, a starting point to understand. So for those who may not be visualizing and seeing the question as we're seeing it, if I ask for a bucket of apples and I get back a collection, do I get back just the identifiers, apple 1, 2, 3, apple 4, 5, 6, or do I get back, instead of those identifiers, do I get a link that is basically a formatted REST call that would allow me to retrieve all the data for each one of those apples? And the key thing, just as a starting point, is if you provide just the identifiers, then you serve the needs of people who need only the identifiers, and that's all they need right now, and those who need to construct a link and get the full data for the apples. But if you provide only a link, you make it very difficult for someone to get just the identifier if that's all they need. Of course, one might say that, well, what you would do with that link is put it on a web page and somebody would click on it and get the information for an apple. That's where you get into the situational conversation in terms of the API. Is the API a protocol where you're going to be calling one API and another, or is each an independent unit of work, which is the more traditional service-based design and would fall clearly within the SOA design space, whereas APIs open up the broader sort of interactions around these calls?
Definitely. I think there's also an aspect of persuasion here, right? When you use links in hypermedia, when you provide these kinds of hints, as an API publisher, you're trying to persuade developers to use your API in a certain way, whereas when you provide identities, you're almost giving them the ability to do whatever they want. It's something to consider when designing.
Yeah, which is how do you want it? How open-ended do you want to be? The identifiers in this sense are more open-ended in terms of what people can do with it versus you're directing them down a particular path if you assume that what they will need next is the full description of the apple, So yeah, there's one more question.
Yeah, so the final question here is an interesting one. It's a question on managing internal APIs. So should internal or private APIs be viewed under the API management umbrella, or should they be looked at as services under an SOA domain? And corollary here, how cost-effective is the use of API management tools to manage your internal APIs?
Yeah, so here's I definitely have some thoughts on that, and part of it gets back to what I was saying earlier. Well, give me different definitions of API and SOA as strategies, and I can answer that question in different ways. And so fundamentally, they are all services, and one way to group them together is to just say, whether I call one or the other an SOA, an API, or I call it either one in different contexts, it's all a service-based strategy. And but I do need to understand the broader parameters for design that the API angle into the conversation opens up. But now when you ask about using an API management tool internally, there's probably two key aspects to that question. I do see folks moving that direction and asking that question, and if that's all you were using to govern your internal development environment, then I think you would not have enough, because it sort of forces you into this, inside the company is just an open market. People can do whatever they want. They'll sign up to use an API if they happen to want to use an API. That's very haphazard in terms of managing the whole portfolio of your solutions. And so there's a conversation around governance, around how the APIs are developed and the like, that leads to a more interesting and broader API platform discussion that draws in some of the key concepts and best practices from SOA as the way we've been doing service-based strategies for the past decade. So there's a broader platform conversation, and as part of that broader conversation, then an API management environment used internally and fit within a governed service-based strategy, I think can have some very interesting aspects in terms of being a front end into developer collaboration, or collaboration between developers and architects, and collaboration between developers, architects, and what I call service portfolio managers, the people that are trying to make sure that you're winding up with a coherent portfolio of services for your SOA and API strategy versus just a haphazard whatever developers happen to create. So it definitely can play a role.
Okay, let me just add to that from a Layer 7 perspective. I know that our tooling can support kind of both modes. I think what Randy's highlighting especially well is that really you have to plan this out. It depends how you implement these tools and what you use them for. That ultimately makes a difference.
Yeah, just dropping it in and not thinking about your processes and your governance won't do you well either way.
So I think we're going to end it there. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and a special thank you to Randy for giving us that great guidance on API design. This is a recorded session, so you will be able to view it afterwards. And if you have more questions, send them in, and we'll take a look, and hopefully we can get back to you. Thanks, Randy.